A couple of really remarkable things happened over the past week. On Wednesday, Obsession, an indie horror movie in its second week of release that was produced for under $1 million, overtook the first Wednesday of The Mandalorian and Grogu, a gigantic Star Wars blockbuster. This weekend, in The Mandalorian and Grogu's second weekend, it is predicted that the film will drop to third place at the domestic box office behind both Obsession in its third weekend and Backrooms, an indie horror movie from a 20-year-old director that was made for under $10 million in its first weekend. Both Obsession and Backrooms are the work of young filmmakers who come from outside the established system. Obsession was directed by Curry Barker, who is 26 years old. Backrooms is directed by Kane Parsons, who is only 20 years old. Both of these filmmakers cut their teeth on YouTube as part of a new wave of filmmakers emerging from that and other video platforms like Markiplier, the Philippou brothers, Michael Shanks, Dan Trachtenberg, and Kogonada, among others. The actual box office results for the weekend are stunning. The Mandalorian and Grogu suffered a catastrophic 70% collapse in its second weekend. Backrooms grossed $81 million over that period, basically matching the $81 million that The Mandalorian and Grogu made in its opening 3 days at a fraction of the budget. Let's just say there's gonna be some meetings at Disney this week.
No.
Meanwhile, Obsession, which had grown in its second weekend, grew again in its third weekend, which is practically unheard of. It's been reported that Barker's already fighting off offers for his next project. This is a very consequential weekend at the theaters. This feels like part of a larger movement that is itself part of a larger moment. Based on current projections, it seems highly likely that Backrooms will open higher than Disclosure Day, the big upcoming blockbuster from iconic and beloved institution Steven Spielberg. Old reliable genres and franchises have struggled a bit in recent years. For example, The Devil Wears Prada 2, a workplace comedy-leg sequel made for under $100 million, has already outgrossed every single superhero movie released last year. And while there are undoubtedly big studio blockbusters coming up that will make lots of money, like Toy Story 5, Spider-Man Brand New Day, and Avengers Doomsday, it still feels like something is happening. Something is shifting. And it has felt that way for a little while now, with Backrooms really solidifying the trend. So this week, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why studio filmmaking is in need of a breath of fresh air. We're going to talk about the possible historical precedent for this moment. And we're going to talk about why, against seemingly all odds, the future might just be bright. Kinda bright yellowy. Over the past couple of decades, Hollywood has been dominated by big franchise films in general, and by big franchise superhero films in particular. 5 of the 10 highest-grossing movies of the 2010s were superhero films. The highest-grossing movie of all time was briefly Avengers Endgame. The 21 MCU films released between 2010 and 2020 grossed a combined total of $21 billion. That's an average of over $1 billion apiece. However, things have changed. In contrast, the 14 such films released since 2021 have only grossed a combined total of $9 billion, for an average of around $700 million apiece. However, this is also somewhat misleading. If we just consider the 3 MCU films released last year, the average drops to $440 million, which is somewhere between 1/3 and a half of what they were making at their prime.
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
Now, obviously, those averages are going to be bolstered this year by the release of Spider-Man Brand New Day and Avengers Doomsday. However, it also seems fair to acknowledge that both films likely face an uphill battle to earn as much as their predecessors did. Brand New Day is not going to earn as much as No Way Home, and it seems unlikely that Doomsday will earn as much as Endgame. So it is perhaps time for a change. The key audience demographic for theaters is between 18 and 34. We've covered this before on the show. All the metrics suggest that the kids love cinema. Call them Gen Zinema. Of course, this is just logical. Kids have free time and they need places to go around which they can organize social activities. As people get older, they have less time to devote to going to the cinema due to other social obligations and responsibilities. Movies that want to be massive successes have to find a way to appeal to younger audiences by meeting them where they are. Call it the Field of Dreams approach.
If you build it, he will come.
These mega franchises, which have saturated the market over the past decade or so, are losing younger audiences. In 2018, 36% of the audience for Black Panther was between 18 and 24. But last year, only 28% of the audience for Captain America: Brave New World fell into that demographic. Which is somehow still lower than Red Hulk's approval rating. It seems people like his taxation policy, I don't know. These movies are not making new fans, and who can blame them? When the big selling point is the return of actors playing characters that they were playing before 18-year-olds were buying their own movie tickets. Who wants to go and see their parents' hand-me-down franchise, led by an actor who's been playing that role for almost half a century? These movies struggling to perform is an obvious source of anxiety for the studios, which spend huge sums of money on them. In fact, those movies have only gotten more and more expensive over time. It has reached the point where the studios themselves are acknowledging superhero fatigue in their marketing. Although that remains a contested term. Personally, I find myself agreeing with James Gunn on this point.
I don't believe in superhero fatigue. I think there's, mediocre movie fatigue.
The problem is that too many of these movies have been and continue to be deeply mediocre, formulaic, and generic blockbusters, shorn of any human identity or perspective, focus group tested and studio noted to death, to the point that of course audiences are less interested in them than they were a decade ago. I mean, how many movies can an average audience member watch that culminate in color-coded energy blasts, a big computer-generated void, or color-coded energy beams in a big computer-generated void? There's nothing new here, just a faded photocopy of a faded photocopy. And look, in case there's any ambiguity here, I love superheroes. Some of my favorite films of this decade so far are superhero movies. The genre is capable of great things.
As far back as I could remember, I always wanted to be a Joker.
Even this year, I had a really lovely time with Wonder Man. And last week, we got to see Nicolas Cage make Nicolas Cage choices to put the spider in Spider-Man, which is just delightful. But the issue is that there were so many of these for so long, and that most of them were content aspiring to be adequate. 20 years is a long time for a genre to dominate mainstream cinema. It is inevitable that an assembly line approach would set in, leading to the law of diminishing returns. It isn't just superhero films. The same logic applies to other big blockbuster franchises like Star Wars or The Fast and the Furious, which have seen similar arcs in terms of box office returns. Audiences yearn for something new, something interesting, and it feels like they might finally be getting it. To understand this moment, it is perhaps instructive to look back to Hollywood history. The 1960s might be the most instructive decade here. Just as modern cinema is dominated by formulaic superhero movies and franchise films, American cinema of the 1950s and 1960s was dominated by formulaic westerns, musicals, and classical epics. These were films produced by the studio system. They are produced in much the same way that modern franchise movies are, according to strict formulas with a heavy emphasis on expensive scale and spectacle. They had their patterns and their routines. Just as modern franchise films are largely shot on green screen sound stages, these movies were often shot in contained studios. Audiences inevitably began to tire of the routine and familiar rhythms of these movies, which just became hollow imitations of themselves. So the genre has faded and receded. This, by the way, has been something that pundits and observers with any grasp of Hollywood history have been predicting would happen to the superhero genre for over a decade now. Now, there's always a little defensive pushback on this point. It's worth noting that the musical and the western didn't completely die, just as the superhero movie won't completely die. There are still musicals and westerns produced today, just as there will always be superhero films produced. However, there are far fewer musicals and westerns today, and those that do exist are both more modern in their sensibilities and higher in average quality. As somebody who likes superhero stories, the idea of there being fewer but more artisanal and higher quality superhero films sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Of course, these genres don't die in a linear fashion. There's no clear moment when the genres could be pronounced dead. Every once in a while, there was a massive hit that was just enough to give the studios justification to keep throwing good money after bad onto the deck of a sinking ship. It's probably worth providing a concrete example here. So in 1963, 20th Century Fox almost drove itself to bankruptcy, spending $40 million on Cleopatra, which, despite being the highest grossing movie of the year, was still a financial black hole for the studio. 2 years later, in 1965, they struck pay dirt with The Sound of Music, a very traditional old-fashioned musical that went on to become the highest grossing movie of all time. Rather than realizing that they'd caught the last lifeboat off the Titanic, The studio took that as a sign to just go all in on the fading musical genre, leading to a series of expensive and catastrophic failures. Dr. Dolittle was such a bomb that the studio once again found itself on the cusp of bankruptcy just 2 years after producing the highest-grossing movie of all time. Hello, Dolly was a similar failure. So few people saw the Julie Andrews vehicle Star, re-teaming with director Robert Wise, that Fox just decided to retitle it as Those Were the Happy Times and re-release it in theaters the following year, hoping that nobody would notice. Think of it as a sort of a proto-Morbius. However, as the studio system was collapsing and these movies were failing, something else was emerging. A new group of young filmmakers, raised by seeing films on television and the first generation to attend film school, broke onto the scene. They produced a wave of films that spoke to audiences increasingly numb to formulaic studio spectacle. It was guerrilla filmmaking, engaged with the moment, made by directors who understood what a younger audience was clamoring for. The transition point fell roughly between 1968 and 1969 with Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider. In particular, Easy Rider was a film wired into the youth counterculture that broke many of the narrative and storytelling conventions of traditional Hollywood cinema. And critics at the time talked about that movie in a way that is not entirely dissimilar from how some critics are discussing Backrooms this week.
There was a part of me watching the movie where, when I was getting lost inside of what he was doing, when he's giving us this first-person perspective, or when you're seeing it through the eyes of a DV cam or a video camera, where I was like, keep going in this direction. Don't worry about going back to what the story is.
Right.
I'll go along with you on the ride. And I know that that's kind of antithetical to like what your kind of most primal experience of joy is at a movie. But I also am like, we can't continue to evolve movies if we don't break them. Like, this is something that's like getting to the point of almost breaking it, which I really, really admired.
This movement came to be known as New Hollywood, and over the next decade or so, it produced some of the best movies of all time, classics that still linger in the consciousness. It reinvented the Western and the musical. It challenged the industry's existing status quo. At the center of this movement were a bunch of filmmakers so young that they came to be known as the movie brats. It's no exaggeration to say that this breath of fresh air reshaped the industry for decades, breathing new life and energy into the medium as a whole, producing films that felt dangerous and alive in exciting ways. However, all of this hung on the studios themselves coming to the realization that they needed to trust these younger emerging artists, that they needed to enable and support them, rather than trying to tame or control them. Now, the 1960s into the 70s is perhaps the most radical moment of reinvention for Hollywood, but there have been others. It's cyclical.
All of this has happened before. All of this will happen again.
In the 1980s, blockbusters became bloated and distended, budgets extended, box office returns began to shrink. Towards the end of the decade and into the early 1990s, there were a couple of catastrophic, expensive, and high-profile failures, such as Days of Thunder or Havana. At the same time, a new generation of even younger filmmakers emerged. Kids raised on VHS rather than television, trained on music videos rather than at film school. Steven Soderbergh, Quentin Tarantino, David Fincher, Spike Jonze, Paul Thomas Anderson. Collectively, they came to be known as the Sundance Kids, who redefined independent cinema and who moved quickly into the mainstream in a system that could still support and empower artists. They provided an injection of passion, life, and vitality into the system just when it needed it. And to be honest, it really feels like Hollywood could use that right now. This particular moment does feel like a transition point for Hollywood, and honestly, I'm not sure in which direction it's going to go. There's every possibility that Hollywood lacks the courage to make the right choice here and to embrace these young talents as the voices of their generation. It could just lead to a bunch of bad creepypasta movies. However, against all odds, I'm gonna choose to believe that things can still be good. After all, this is not all unfamiliar ground. Part of the reaction to the success of young directors like Kane Parsons or Curry Barker has involved elaborate conspiracy theories that they did not direct their own movies. In truth, this is just a reflection of a deep anxiety about the emergence of a younger generation coming up to take the place of their elders. Spielberg was 27 when he made Jaws. Paul Thomas Anderson was 27 when he made Boogie Nights. Quentin Tarantino was 28 when he made Reservoir Dogs. Orson Welles was 25 when he made Citizen Kane, arguably the greatest movie of all time. Steven Soderbergh was 26 when he made Sex, Lies, and Videotape. It's worth acknowledging here that the emergence of a new generation doesn't mean that the handful of true artists working in contemporary cinema will be displaced. The new Hollywood movement unfolded in parallel to the work of already established veteran directors from the 1950s like Stanley Kubrick or Sidney Lumet, and so it seems likely that existing filmmakers like Christopher Nolan or Denis Villeneuve will continue on their own paths in parallel to these emerging young talents. There's also something cyclical in this. George Lucas's Star Wars was at once a product of the new Hollywood movement and a film that heralded the beginning of its end, the arrival of the blockbuster. The Force Awakens wasn't the first leg of sequel, but it did set the tone for the decade that followed. With that in mind, it feels appropriate that The Mandalorian and Grogu might serve a similar purpose in this blockbuster era, drawing the curtain down on those kinds of films. Hell, even Spielberg's Disclosure Day being potentially eclipsed by Parsons' Backrooms feels like a certain form of symmetry. Spielberg's Jaws, for example, eclipsed Billy Wilder's remake of The Front Page, a symbolic passing of the torch from one generation to the next. It is a concern that so many of these emerging young filmmakers seem to come primarily from horror. But that speaks to larger structural issues of modern Hollywood, where the majority of films that studios will support outside of big-budget tentpoles are cheap, low-risk, high-reward horror movies. The studios do need to diversify again to support the production of a wider variety of genres at a wider degree of price points.
No.
What?
No.
However, what is most heartening about the movies made by this younger generation of filmmaker is that they feel like actual movies. They are love letters to cinema as an art form, in much the same way that films made by the movie brats were. While The Mandalorian and Grogu, a movie directed by a 59-year-old veteran filmmaker, is just a formless, shapeless mess of content, 4 episodes of television shoved in a trench coat and walking into a theater, Obsession and Backrooms are proper films. They have themes, construction, arcs, characters. Backrooms in particular draws heavily from Kubrick's Shining or Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's a substantial supporting role given to indie film director Mark Duplass, in what feels similar to Spielberg throwing a white lab coat on Francois Truffaut and folding him into Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There's a real love of the medium here, even from artists emerging from outside it. It's enough to make me optimistic about the future of cinema. We're so Backrooms. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.